Hey, guess what? I forced a bot to watch 1,000 hours of Sex and the City content and asked it to write the very first episode of Season 2 of And Just Like That.
Why?
Interior, New York City. Miranda, a recovering alcoholic, orders her third glass of wine as Carrie, a living horse skeleton, dines on a stiletto heel. A fabulous tension in the air. Miranda, I can't afford the check on my student salary. My son is sleeping with his girlfriend, and mine dumped me. Carrie looks up from her delicious heel. Carrier, my husband used to bang his girlfriends. Miranda nods with a knowing smile as Charlotte, Jewish, supermom, enters the city. Charlotte, my daughter, son renounced Hanukkah on TikTok. What is TikTok? Carrie, my husband used TikTok. The room goes silent until Anthony, stylish bread man, storms into the restaurant, slamming papers on the table. He is furious. Anthony, my shorts are filled with triple dipped fudge. I'm suing the city. Carrie, my husband used to fill his pants with. Carrie is sideswiped by Anthony's backhand. Anthony, less husbands, more shoes, and I say that with love. Miranda polishes off her fifth glass of wine as Charlotte nods with disapproval. Suddenly, the waiter appears with a tray full of Cosmopolitans because this is nostalgia.
That was garbage.
So what you're saying is you don't respect content made for women.
Wait, what? And just like that, the first season of the Sex and the City revival is done. And while at the time of recording this video, we don't know whether or not we'll be subject to another season of this, let's call it divisive series, I feel like any further continuation has to take somewhat of a back seat to one of the biggest lingering issues that I have with this season. And I mean, the biggest lingering issue. Because if I'm honest with myself, I feel like I would end up making a 20+ minute takedown of everything that just didn't work for me with this series, but I don't want to do that. With that being said, I do feel like it's worth mentioning some of the brighter spots of this season, especially in comparison to some of the more negative takes that were thrown around during this season. On a surface level, I feel like it's perfectly fine to portray Miranda, of all people, as the one character that is suffering from a midlife crisis. How they decided to do that, specifically in the first half of the season, is what we'll be discussing later in this video. The Lily stuff made me laugh. I know some people have a problem with the way that she's portrayed as a budding boss girl in the first few episodes before crumbling into a childish brat in the later part of the season, but she's a teenage character. What do you want from her? Che is a decent character, for the most part. I feel like they don't do enough to justify some of the hate they're getting from social media, but who knows these days? The very way that I'm structuring this sentence probably has more than a little to do with the way people are perceiving them. To be fair and balanced, I'll share some of the thoughts that I've received on this character from a third party. Quote, Jay is great, smoking weed at a funeral, can only talk about sex, encourages Carrie to be on drugs, and drops off tequila at her apartment when she's recovering from surgery, and knows she's hopped on prescription drugs. Is rude to fans, never asks Miranda's relationship status, doesn't tell Miranda about California, slams shots in front of Miranda, the recovering alcoholic. They scripted a stellar person there. So yeah, it is fair to say that me, along with a lot of other fans, have fairly different perspectives. But to be fair, I wouldn't put it all on Shay as a person in real life. For one, I feel like Shay wears their personality on their sleeve, and a lot of those moments fall more on Miranda than Shay, in my opinion. So yeah, I am willing to give them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the way they're portrayed in this show. All the men characters are pretty awesome in this show. Even big somehow, which is surprising. I'm treating this as a positive only because the show itself treats it like one. In reality, all the major hangups are built around the female cast, and the series doesn't have time to deal with the flaws of its male leads. That, of course, makes this a major problem with this entire series, but in isolation, the men in this show are funny, sympathetic, and very likable. Finally, nearly all the returning characters feel genuine to their previous iterations. We can get into the specifics and minor inconsistencies in the comments, but these days I feel it's so common for revivals to completely miss the mark in that regard, so I'm counting it as a plus. With that being said, and again, to be completely fair and balanced, here are some of the issues that I have that are outside of the biggest one that we're going to discuss later in this video. This series desperately needs Samantha Jones, and not for lack of blunt sexual conversations or imagery, but because I feel like she could have easily played a perfect foil to some of the nonsense going on throughout the story. Just to clarify, I understand the behind-the-scenes issues that are currently keeping Samantha out of the proceedings, but it feels like the writers of And Just Like That did their best to dismantle or largely ignore any major long-term relationship previously established in the previous 6 seasons and 2 movies, all for what seems like for the sake of returning to the status quo. They killed off Big because Carrie needed to be single again, and also because Big was kind of a terrible person in the original series, and they might not have wanted to deal with that potential backlash for a happy marriage. I guess somewhat completely undermining the concept that people can change and relationships change people. I don't really know. Either way, it did end up leading to them deleting scenes that ultimately don't make sense with the show's flow afterwards. If you ask me, it might have been more interesting to continue the storyline from the movies where Carrie and Big are working on their marriage instead of throwing it all out at the very beginning of the revival, especially since Widow Carrie doesn't really translate well throughout this entire season. Every scene of Carrie mourning feels so self-centered and over-dramatized, to the point where I don't feel like she had any real connection with him at all. She's just milking this for all she can. I mean, even the characters in the show make that pretty clear. If this is really the direction they wanted to go down with this character, I feel like Samantha could have given the show a much-needed couples perspective. If the writers were keen on trying to blow up norms but also return to the status quo, it would have been kind of interesting to see Miranda's midlife crisis or Carrie dealing with being single again played up against a serious relationship for Samantha. Just saying. Rock sucks. It seems rather strange to me that people in this fandom are actively hating Lily when there's a far worse character in the Goldenblatt household. And no, before anyone goes in that direction, it has nothing to do with the way they're portrayed in the show. Hell, I just went to bat for Che of all people in this series. No, I'm talking about how disrespectful of a character they are. It's actually quite mind-numbing and one of the worst issues that this show is currently presenting. Seriously, there is absolutely no reason for any of this. It is totally fine to explore the issue of transgendered children in the home, but the show doesn't bother with that. They introduce it as an issue before briskly moving on to a reality where everyone in Rock's life now accepts their decision, and we're faced with an even more annoying prospect of a lazy, ungrateful child who instantly burns down any goodwill they might have earned throughout this series. Seriously, kid, what are you rebelling against? What are the writers trying to do with this character arc? I honestly don't know. Look, I thought the point of these videos was to keep them short.
YouTube likes longer videos.
Oh, you know that for a fact. Anyway, with all of that being said, and trust me, there's a lot more on both ends, but we just can't make this video very long. It's about time to start focusing on my biggest issue with this ridiculous series: Miranda's alcoholism, or blatant lack thereof. This series started with Miranda attempting to order a glass of wine at 10:45 in the morning. She snuck a bottle of wine into Big's funeral and hides several shot-sized bottles of Tito's vodka in her purse. It's so much of a problem that she believes that Charlotte was bold enough to passive-aggressively buy her a book in order to help her stop drinking. And it isn't until after she gets plastered at Carrie's apartment and cheats on her husband that she realizes that she bought the book for herself during a blackout state. Quite seriously, for Miranda as a character. Hell, any character throughout this entire series, the first 6 seasons, 2 movies, and this revival, it's one of the most real and consequential storylines that they've ever decided to tell. She has a problem, and she needs to quit. We've dealt with it for 5 episodes. and we're going to see the fallout through the next 5. Except after coming to that blistering realization and knowing that she has to turn her life around, she quits. From there, the only lip service ever given to this issue again is a nodding recognition from Charlotte in the very next episode. This is a revival to a series that glamorized the consumption of alcohol in the late 90s, early 2000s, with cosmopolitans being prominent enough to be considered the 5th member of the group.
This has been building for years, so I'm just gonna say it. You think I'm not part of the inner circle.
And yet, instead of using that as an excuse to pivot into a relatable and pervasive storyline for the rest of the series, this revival simply sweeps it under the rug because I'm not even sure why. Did they think they needed another excuse to deal with Miranda's failing marriage? As if they couldn't fathom how a growing addiction wouldn't lead to those issues in the first place. Seriously, I'm at a loss for words when it comes to this specific decision from the showrunners here. Abuse of alcohol is a legitimate issue, something that affects a significant number of people throughout the world. And whether you've experienced this issue for yourself or maybe you know somebody who has gone through it, I feel like this is somewhat of a universally understood situation. People who end up suffering with substance abuse end up fighting hard to conquer their addictions. And yet, just like that, Miranda moves on, replacing her addiction for a new sexual relationship. I don't know, maybe I'm placing too much of an emphasis on this, but I feel like it shouldn't have been that easy. I'm not a doctor or scientist, so I can't 100% say that I'm sure here, but I feel like it would have been better and way more believable for Miranda to deal with that specific issue instead of the producers trying to speedrun her through a midlife crisis, complete with blowing up one of the most stable relationships this series has ever seen. At the end of the day, I'd say that this is the biggest problem with this revival. On top of everything else that we've talked about, both good and bad, I feel like effortlessly fixing Miranda's very real problem in order to move on to the next hot button issue is indicative of the mentality of this series' moral outlook, where real world issues are fodder for many character arcs for our main characters to experience as we glide towards an ending marred by rose-colored glasses. That type of approach might have made a little bit more sense 20 years ago when the show was more episodic and our main characters were less established in their lives. But glossing over potentially serious narratives in 2022 feels a little disingenuous, if nothing else. But that's just my take.
You know what? Gotta give it to you. That's a pretty good point.
Yeah. Hey, you want to go grab a drink?
Really?
The KRW Network.